1962. The Saturday Evening Post, one of the most widely read magazines in America, arrives in millions of homes. Inside is an article that should not exist. It is written by Eunice Kennedy Shriver, the sister of the President of the United States. And in it, she does something no member of her family has ever done in public. She tells America that the Kennedys have a secret. She reveals that she has a sister named Rosemary, that Rosemary was born with an intellectual disability, that the family has for decades kept her largely out of view. She writes about the shame that families like hers were taught to feel, and she says, in effect, that the shame was wrong. It is a quietly astonishing act. The Kennedys did not admit weakness. They did not discuss private pain. They built an image of golden, effortless success, and they defended it ruthlessly. And here is the president's own sister in a national magazine, opening the one door the family had spent 20 years holding shut. But read the article closely, and you notice what is not in it. She does not tell America the whole truth about what happened to Rosemary. She writes of a disability her sister was born with. She does not write about the operation. She does not write about the 2 holes drilled into her sister's skull in the autumn of 1941, or about who authorized it, or about what her sister was like before it and what she became after. She tells the country a partial truth, and she keeps the rest. Why? Why would a woman brave enough to reveal the family's most guarded secret stop short of revealing the worst of it? Why protect the very thing she was exposing? The answer to that question is the real story of Eunice Kennedy Shriver. Because she spent the rest of her life doing something extraordinary and something contradictory at the same time. She built a global movement out of her sister's tragedy, a movement that has touched millions of lives on every continent. And she did it while never once publicly blaming the man who caused the tragedy. That man was her father. Her name was Eunice Kennedy Shriver, and this is the story of a daughter who loved her father, worshipped her father, and spent 40 years quietly building a monument to everything her father got wrong. Before we go back to the beginning, hold on to a few things, because each one is a thread that ties into the knot at the center of this story. The operation that changed everything was authorized by one parent without telling the other, and the mother did not find out until it was already done. The deepest layer of the secret, the operation itself, stayed hidden from the American public for 46 years. The sister at the heart of it could only come home to her family after a stroke silenced the father who had sent her away. And the woman who built a global movement out of this tragedy spent her whole life denying, in public, that her own sister was the reason. Keep those in mind. Each one pays off before we are done. To understand what Eunice never forgave, you first have to understand what her father took. Rosemary Kennedy was the third of the 9 Kennedy children, born in September of 1918, the eldest daughter, and her life was marked by difficulty from its very first moments. The circumstances of her birth were, by the accounts that have come down, a quiet catastrophe in themselves. During the delivery, with the doctor not yet present, a nurse reportedly instructed Rose Kennedy to keep the baby from being born until the physician arrived, and physically delayed the birth. Whether that account is complete or exact, what is not in dispute is that Rosemary emerged with difficulties that would shape her entire life. She developed more slowly than her siblings. She struggled with skills that came easily to the others. Now understand the family she was born into, because the family is the whole tragedy. The Kennedys were built on performance. Joseph P. Kennedy, the father, was a man of relentless ambition who had been shut out of Boston's Protestant establishment and had decided his children would walk into every room that had ever been closed to him. He drove them, he graded them, he set them against each other at the dinner table and rewarded the winners. The entire family was an engine designed to produce achievement, and its fuel was competition. Into that engine came a daughter who could not compete on those terms. For a family whose entire identity was excellence, a child who struggled was not simply a private sorrow. In the thinking of that era, and in the specific thinking of Joseph Kennedy, she was a problem to be managed, a liability to an image, a crack in a surface the whole family was working to keep flawless. And this is where Eunice enters the story, because Eunice was the sister who refused to see Rosemary that way. Eunice Mary Kennedy was born in July of 1921, 3 years after Rosemary, and of all the siblings, she was the one who attached herself most closely to her older sister. There is something worth pausing on here. Eunice was, by every account, one of the fiercest and most competitive of all the Kennedy children. She was athletic, driven, intensely intelligent, and in temperament more like her brothers than like her sisters. People who knew the family said that of all the daughters, Eunice was the one who most had the fire the father prized, the one who might have gone furthest in politics had she been born a generation later or been born a son. So this was not a weak or sentimental child taking pity on a sibling. This was the strongest of the daughters choosing to stand beside the most vulnerable one. It is worth spending a moment on who Eunice actually was, because the culture has largely reduced her to a kind of saintly charity figure, and that reduction hides the far more interesting truth. Eunice was not gentle by nature. She was ferociously competitive, physically tough, and impatient with weakness in herself. She swam, she sailed, she played to win, and she carried into adulthood a restless drive that unsettled people who expected a Kennedy woman to be decorative. She went to Stanford. She worked in the Justice Department on juvenile delinquency, then in social work in a women's prison, and with troubled youth in Chicago. This was a woman who wanted, badly, to do serious work in the world, in an era that offered a Kennedy daughter almost no path to it. People who knew the family said it plainly. Had Eunice been born a man, or born later, she might have been the one who ran for president. She had more of her father's fire than most of her brothers. Her son would later say that if she had been born in a different time, she would have been the Kennedy in the White House. Hold that against what she chose to do with her life, because it sharpens the whole story. This was not a woman with no other options pouring herself into charity because nothing else was available. This was one of the most capable people her family ever produced, choosing to spend that capability on the population her father had taught the world to discard. She had the ambition to build an empire, and she pointed it at the people no one else would even look at. Eunice and Rosemary were close. There is something worth pausing on here. Eunice was, by every account, one of the fiercest and most competitive of all the Kennedy children. Eunice included her. She played with her, competed alongside her in a way that let Rosemary participate, brought her into the activities the other children might have left her out of. Where the family's competitive machinery had no place for Rosemary, Eunice made one. Hold on to that childhood bond, because everything Eunice did in the second half of her life grew directly out of it. She did not build the Special Olympics from an abstract idea about disability. She built it from a specific person she had loved since she was a small girl, and from what was done to that person. Because as Rosemary grew into adulthood, the family's problem, in Joseph Kennedy's eyes, grew with her. By her late teens and early 20s, Rosemary was a strikingly attractive young woman. She had been presented at court in England during her father's ambassadorship, and had carried it off. But she was also increasingly difficult to manage within the family's rigid need for control. There are accounts of mood swings, of frustration, of behavior the family found alarming. She was placed in a convent, and there were reports that she would slip out at night. Put yourself inside Joseph Kennedy's mind in 1941, because his logic, monstrous as its result was, is the key to the whole story. His sons were his future. Joe Jr. was being groomed for the presidency. Jack was coming up behind him. The entire Kennedy project depended on an unblemished public image, on the appearance of a perfect, blessed, all-American family. A daughter whose behavior was unpredictable, who might do something that embarrassed the family, who might in his fearful imagination bring scandal to the name, was, in his calculation, a threat to everything he was building. He went looking for a solution. And in 1941, in the medical culture of that moment, he found one that was being sold to desperate families as a miracle. The lobotomy. Let me handle this part carefully and factually, because it is the hinge of everything, and it deserves to be told plainly rather than luridly. In 1941, the prefrontal lobotomy was a new and aggressively promoted procedure in American medicine. Its leading champion in the United States was a neurologist named Walter Freeman, who, together with a surgeon named James Watts, performed the operations and marketed them energetically to families and institutions as a treatment for a wide range of conditions. The procedure involved cutting the connections in the frontal lobes of the brain. The science behind it was thin, the outcomes were unpredictable, and frequently devastating. Only a few hundred had been performed. Joseph Kennedy arranged for Rosemary to be evaluated. Freeman and Watts recommended the operation, and in November of 1941, when Rosemary was 23 years old, it was carried out. The details of what happened in that operating room have been documented, and I will give them to you soberly because the soberness is the point. Rosemary was awake during the procedure. The surgeons made their cuts gradually and asked her to speak, to recite, to sing, using her responses to judge how far to go. They continued until she became incoherent. That was the end point. The result was catastrophic and permanent. The vibrant, attractive, difficult young woman who had been presented at court was gone. In her place was a person who could not speak in full sentences, could not walk properly, could not care for herself, and would require institutional care for the rest of her life. Skills she had possessed were simply erased. Some she would slowly, partially relearn over years. Most she would not. Rosemary Kennedy was 23 years old, and her life, in every sense that she had lived it, was over. Now here is the detail that turns a tragedy into something harder to forgive, and it is the detail that sits at the center of this entire story. Joseph Kennedy did not tell his wife. By the accounts that have come down, including from serious biographers, Rose Kennedy, Rosemary's mother, was not informed that the lobotomy was going to happen. She learned of it only after it was done, when the damage was already permanent and irreversible. The decision to drill into their daughter's brain was made by one parent alone, in secret, and presented to the other as an accomplished fact. And it did not stop there. After the operation, Rosemary disappeared from the family's life almost entirely. She was placed in institutions and eventually settled at St. Coletta, a Catholic institution in Wisconsin, an hour west of Milwaukee, where a private house was built for her and her caregivers. For roughly 2 decades, the younger Kennedy children barely knew where she was. She was, in a sense, erased twice. First by the operation that took her mind, and then by the secrecy that took her from her own family. Consider the completeness of that erasure, because it is worse than it first sounds. This was not a case of a family placing a disabled relative in care and continuing to visit her, which was common enough in that era. Rosemary was effectively removed from the family's collective life. The younger siblings were not given a clear account of what had happened to her. Visits for a long stretch did not happen. A person who had been a daily presence in a crowded, boisterous household simply became an absence that no one was permitted to examine. And the cover story shifted over the years to fit the family's needs. At various points, the public was told Rosemary was shy, or that she had become a teacher, or that she preferred a quiet life away from the spotlight. Each version was designed to close the subject rather than open it. The one thing none of the stories mentioned was an operating room in Washington in November of 1941. Now think about what this meant for Eunice specifically. The sister she had loved and protected since childhood, the sister she had made room for when the family's machinery had no place for her, was subjected to an operation she did not consent to and could not understand, and then removed from everyone's life. And it was done by the father Eunice adored. That is the wound this entire story turns on. And to understand why Eunice's response took the strange, contradictory, magnificent form it did, you have to understand her relationship with her father. Because Eunice did not hate Joseph Kennedy. She loved him intensely. Of all the daughters, Eunice was arguably the closest to her father in temperament and the one who most sought and won his approval. She had his drive, his intensity, his competitiveness. The bond between them was real and deep. This was not a daughter looking for a reason to turn against her father. And that is exactly what makes what happened next so remarkable. Eunice never got to have the simple response. She could not simply condemn him because she loved him, and because in the world she had been raised in, you did not condemn Joseph Kennedy, and you did not air the family's wounds in public. So she did something else. She took the rage, if rage is even the right word for something so complicated, and she turned it into work. And it is worth being precise about why the simple response was closed to her, because it explains the shape of everything that followed. Consider the bind she was in. To openly condemn her father, she would have had to break the single most powerful rule of the family she belonged to, a rule Joseph Kennedy himself had written and enforced. The family closes ranks. The family protects the image. The family never shows the wound in public. To denounce him for Rosemary would have been to weaponize the very secret the family was organized around keeping. It would have been an act of war against everyone she loved, not only her father, but her mother, her brothers, the whole enterprise. And there was the harder problem underneath it. She loved him, not dutifully, but genuinely. He had been, to her specifically, an encouraging and attentive father in the ways that had nothing to do with Rosemary. The same man capable of authorizing that operation was the man who had believed in Eunice's intelligence and drive when the era gave a daughter little room for either. Human beings are not tidy. You can be the recipient of a father's real love and the sibling of his worst victim at the same time, and Eunice was both. That is the vice she lived inside. She could not condemn him without betraying her family and her own heart. She could not approve of what he had done without betraying Rosemary. So she found the only exit available to a person caught between two loyalties that could not be reconciled. She let her life be the verdict her mouth never delivered. But first, the secret held. For 20 years, it held. Through the 1940s and 1950s, as the Kennedy sons rose, as Jack went to Congress and then the Senate, and then began his march toward the presidency, Rosemary remained in Wisconsin, unmentioned. The public story was that she was shy, or that she was a teacher, or that she had withdrawn from public life. The truth, the operation and its aftermath, was buried. And here is a crucial fact about the timeline that tells you something about the whole family. The lobotomy itself, the fact that Rosemary had been surgically altered, was not revealed to the public until 1987. It came out in a book by the historian Doris Kearns Goodwin, more than 4 decades after it happened. For most of the lives of everyone involved, the deepest layer of the secret stayed sealed. So when Eunice wrote her Saturday Evening Post article in 1962, she was operating inside a family that was still, and would remain for another quarter-century, committed to concealing the worst of it. That is why the article told only part of the truth. She revealed the disability. She did not reveal the operation. She opened the door as far as the family would allow it to be opened, and no further. But understand what even that partial opening cost, and what it began. The year before that article, in 1961, the situation began to change, and it changed because of a specific event. Joseph Kennedy suffered a severe stroke. It left him incapacitated, unable to speak, confined to a wheelchair for the rest of his life. The man who had made the decision, who had kept the secret, who had controlled the family's story with an iron grip, was suddenly silenced. And with his control removed, the family began, quietly, to reconnect with Rosemary. Siblings who had barely known where she was began to visit. The wall he had built started slowly to come down. It is one of the grim ironies of this story that Rosemary's siblings could only fully return to her life once the father who had removed her from it could no longer prevent them. Eunice led that return. And she did more than visit, she began to build. In 1962, the same year as the article, Eunice started a day camp at her own home in Maryland called Camp Shriver. She invited children with intellectual disabilities at a time when such children were routinely hidden away, institutionalized, and written off as incapable. She had them run, swim, ride, compete, play. She wanted to prove something that the entire culture of the time denied, that people with intellectual disabilities were capable, that they had potential, that they deserved to be seen. There is something almost defiant in the smallness of how it started. She did not wait for a foundation, a board, or permission. She opened her own backyard. She got in the pool with the children herself. People who were there described her as physically hands-on, unafraid of the children in a way that startled a society trained to keep its distance from them, holding them, coaching them, refusing to treat them as fragile or frightening. She was, in her own yard, modeling the exact behavior she wanted the world to learn. Camp Shriver was the seed, and in 1968, it grew into something that would change the world. The first International Special Olympics Games were held in Chicago in July of 1968. Eunice Kennedy Shriver stood up and declared them open. About 1,000 athletes with intellectual disabilities from the United States and Canada competed. From that beginning, the Special Olympics became one of the largest movements of its kind on Earth, eventually involving millions of athletes in nearly every country in the world. It fundamentally changed how societies think about, treat, and include people with intellectual disabilities. It is not an exaggeration to say that Eunice Kennedy Shriver did more to advance the dignity of disabled people than almost any other private individual of the 20th century. To grasp how radical this was, you have to remember what the world was like for people with intellectual disabilities when Eunice started. They were routinely institutionalized for life, often in appalling conditions. They were hidden by their families out of shame. They were widely assumed to be incapable of learning, of achievement, of joy, of dignity. The prevailing medical and social attitude was containment, not development. Exposés of the institutions of that era, when they finally came, horrified the public with scenes of neglect that most people had never been asked to look at. Eunice attacked that entire worldview, not with a pamphlet, but with a spectacle the world could not ignore. She put disabled athletes on a track, in front of crowds, in front of cameras, winning, straining, celebrating, weeping with pride. She made the abstract argument about human dignity into something a viewer could see with their own eyes and could not unsee. That was the genius of it. She understood, perhaps from growing up in the most image-conscious family in America, that you do not change how people think by telling them. You change it by showing them something they cannot deny. And she built all of it on the foundation of what happened to Rosemary. Now let me connect this back to the question we started with, because this is where the real answer lives. Eunice always publicly downplayed the direct connection. When asked, she tended to deny that Rosemary was the specific inspiration for the Special Olympics. She spoke in broader terms, about disability in general, about a national problem, about doing better. But look at what she actually did, and the denial becomes almost transparent. She took the exact nature of her sister's destruction and inverted it, point for point. Her father had treated Rosemary as a liability to be hidden. Eunice built a global stage to make people like Rosemary visible. Her father had acted out of shame. Eunice spent her life attacking the very idea that disability was shameful. Her father had decided that a person who could not compete on the family's terms had no place. Eunice created an entire Olympics whose founding premise was that these were people who could compete, who deserved to compete, whose competition was worth the world's attention. Her father had tried to erase Rosemary. Eunice spent 40 years making sure the world could not look away from people like her. This was not a coincidence. This was an answer. Everything Eunice built was a direct, sustained, decades-long response to a specific act of cruelty done by a specific man. She was, in the most literal sense, spending her life undoing what her father had done. One child, one camp, one competition, one country at a time. And she never said so out loud. She never stood up and named him. That is the contradiction at the heart of Eunice Kennedy Shriver, and it is why the title of this story has to be handled with honesty. Did Eunice never forgive her father? Let me be straight with you, because this is where the record demands care, and where a lesser telling would simply invent a dramatic confrontation that never happened. Eunice Kennedy Shriver never publicly denounced her father. She never gave an interview declaring that she hated him for what he did to Rosemary. She never wrote the searing essay. In public, she maintained the loyalty the family demanded, and she seems to have genuinely felt love for him alongside whatever else she felt. There is no document, no quote, no moment where she says the words this title implies. So if you are looking for a scene where Eunice curses her father's name, it does not exist, and I am not going to fabricate one for you. But here is what the record does show, and it is in some ways more powerful than any speech would have been. Actions are a kind of testimony, and Eunice's actions testify to something her words never would. You do not spend 40 years building a monument to the dignity of the people your father tried to erase unless something inside you refuses to accept what he did. You do not take your family's most shameful secret and turn it into your life's public work unless, at some level, you have judged that secret and found it unforgivable. The Special Olympics is not the behavior of a woman at peace with her father's decision. It is the behavior of a woman who could not undo the past and so spent her life doing the next best thing, which was to make sure it kept happening to no one else, and to lift up the very population her father had taught the world to look away from. The forgiveness question, then, has a subtler answer than the title suggests, and the honest version is more interesting than the dramatic one. Eunice may well have forgiven her father as a daughter in the private, complicated way that people forgive the parents they love. But she never forgave the act. She never made peace with what was done to Rosemary. And the proof is not in anything she said, it is in everything she built. She spent her life turning her father's worst decision into the world's gain, and she did it without ever letting him or the family off the hook in the only court that mattered to her, which was the court of what she actually did with her days. There is a detail from the later years that captures all of this better than any argument could. In the 1980s, Eunice brought Rosemary more fully back into the life of the family. She had her visit. She included her at gatherings. After decades in which Rosemary had been kept apart, her sister deliberately, patiently wove her back in among the siblings and the nieces and nephews and the next generation. Think about what that means. The sister who had made room for Rosemary when they were children, in a family whose machinery had no place for her, was still making room for her half a century later, after everything. The bond that started this whole story was the same bond that closed it. Eunice was, first and last, the sister who would not let Rosemary be left out. Rosemary Kennedy lived to be 86 years old. She died in January of 2005 in Wisconsin at a hospital with her siblings around her. Eunice was there, Jean was there, Ted was there. The family that had once erased her was, at the end, gathered at her bedside. She had outlived the father who ordered the operation by more than 30 years. She had outlived the brothers whose golden futures her disappearance had been meant to protect, both of them cut down by assassins' bullets, so that the image Joseph Kennedy had sacrificed his daughter to preserve was, in the cruelest way, shattered anyway. And she had been brought home, in every way that still remained possible, by the sister who never stopped loving her. Eunice Kennedy Shriver died 4 years later, in August of 2009, at the age of 88. By then, the movement she had founded reached millions of people around the world. The tributes called her one of the most consequential Americans of her century, a woman who had changed the moral landscape of how the world treats its most vulnerable people. Almost none of those tributes fully explained where it had come from. They spoke of her compassion, her energy, her vision. They spoke less about the 23-year-old girl in a Washington operating room in 1941, and the father who put her there, and the little sister who never forgot. Now let me be straight with you about the sources, because this story sits at the intersection of documented history and family silence, and the two do not always agree. The firm ground is substantial. The fact of Rosemary's lobotomy, its date, the surgeons involved, and its catastrophic result are documented, much of it through the work of the historian Doris Kearns Goodwin, whose 1987 book first brought the operation into public knowledge, and through later biographers including Lawrence Leamer and the dedicated biography of Rosemary by Kate Clifford Larson. That Joseph Kennedy authorized it and that Rose was not informed until afterward is supported across these serious accounts. Eunice's founding of Camp Shriver and the Special Olympics, her 1962 article, and the family's reconnection with Rosemary after Joseph's 1961 stroke are all matters of public record. The soft ground is the interior life. What Eunice actually felt about her father, in the privacy of her own heart, is not something the historical record can fully deliver, because she did not put it on the page and she did not say it into a microphone. The reading I have offered you, that her life's work was itself a form of judgment on what her father did, is an interpretation. It is, I would argue, the interpretation that best fits the facts, but it is an interpretation, and an honest teller should say so rather than pretend to read a dead woman's mind. The place where you should be most cautious is any account that puts specific angry words in Eunice's mouth, or that dramatizes a confrontation between her and her father over Rosemary. Those scenes are, as far as the reliable record shows, not documented. The truth is quieter and, I think, more moving. She did not shout, she built. So go back to that magazine, arriving in millions of American homes in 1962. The president's sister telling the country a secret and holding one back. For 60 years, people have read that as caution, as a half measure, as the most a Kennedy was willing to reveal. Look at it again with everything you now know, and it reads differently. That article was not the end of what Eunice was willing to do about Rosemary. It was the beginning. She could not tell the whole truth in print, not with her father still alive, not with the family's rules still in force, not with the deepest layer of the secret still 25 years from surfacing. So she told what she could in words, and she told the rest in actions, and the actions lasted the rest of her life and reached around the world. Her father took one girl who could not compete and decided she had no place in the world. Her daughter's answer was to build a world with a place for every one of them. That was not forgiveness. That was something better. That was repair, carried out patiently across half a century by the one person who had loved Rosemary from the beginning and refused, to the very end, to look away. And here is the last thing, the piece that shows how far the ripples traveled. It was not only Eunice. When Jack Kennedy became president, he pushed for the first federal legislation addressing intellectual disability and mental health in a serious way, signing a landmark act in 1963 in the final weeks of his life. Ted Kennedy spent decades in the Senate as a champion of disability rights and health care for the vulnerable. The family that had once hidden Rosemary in silence became, through her siblings, one of the most consequential forces for disability rights in American history. They could not give Rosemary back what was taken from her. Nothing could. But between them, quietly and then not so quietly, her brothers and her sisters spent their public lives making sure the country would treat the next Rosemary better than their father had treated theirs. Eunice led that. She always led it. Because she was the one who had been there at the beginning, the fierce little sister who made room at the family's table for the girl who could not keep up, and who spent the next 70 years making room at the world's table for everyone like her. She never forgave the act,